the letter in the mail says Dominion's coming through, and they want us to think there's nothing we can do. Hard to believe, but we found out it's true. They want to build a 42-inch pipeline. We don't want your pipeline. We don't want your pipeline. We'll take the sunshine, the water, and wind. We're gonna put a stop sign on Dominion's pipeline. Go tell your neighbors, go tell your friends.
It was the 8 permits they didn't have, and they didn't have them because of legal challenges. So ultimately, the legal challenges, the legal battles were the single most important factor, right, as far as pushing off the day of decision to the point where Dominion couldn't win anymore.
.501c3 gives you advantages because you can fundraise. Gives you, at least with the group I work with now, which is the Blue Ridge Environmental Defense League, it gives you protection from the overall group, from the corporation. And so there are protections that you gain when you're a 501c3, but there are other groups that don't want to do that. They don't want to raise money. They just want to do work.
Part of wanting to hit the ground running, when you get a fiscal sponsor like we did, you don't have to, you can hit the ground running a lot sooner. And I think that was a big motivation for that. Also for us, FON, we didn't have any clear reason that we needed to get our own 501c3 status. I never heard any compelling reasons to do that. A compelling reason would be that you are not able to find a fiscal sponsor that will work with you as easily as Virginia Organizing did.
It was just absolutely essential that Friends of Nelson and ABRA and all the other groups got together in a big coalition. And everybody, I think Rick is exactly right. The groups all had different approaches that they were taking, but the coalition provided a vehicle for everybody to get on message, to understand what the strategy was, and to focus at critical moments. And I think probably the thing that stands out for me the most is after the Fourth Circuit threw out the Forest Service permit and said the Forest Service didn't have the legal authority to allow the pipeline to cross the Appalachian Trail, Dominion went to Congress and said, we want a law, we want a rider. And they had 2 sentences. The company had 2 sentences it was trying to inject into any bill in Washington language, any train leaving the station, any piece of legislation that was going to move, they wanted to stick this rider in. And the ABRA coalition and all the member groups got organized, called their representatives, called their senators, and that didn't happen. Dominion was never successful in getting that legislation passed. And there are dozens of examples like that of the power of a unified coalition. And Lou Freeman, who ran the ABRA coalition, made sure to make that an inclusive tent.
One of the things that happened was there was a huge amount of public opinion and organizations coming together early on in the process. It did not take long for the people of Nelson to rally once everybody started getting the notifications that the pipeline was going to come through their property or their neighbor's property. And I think that one of the important things for the viewers to understand perhaps is that the more different organizations that you can get to come together from the communities that are going to be impacted, all the way from West Virginia to North Carolina, the better off you are, because they all come at it from a different perspective. They all have potentially a different source of income. money becomes important. One of the first things I remember talking to the Friends of Nelson about was, we're going to need for you to start thinking about how you're going to raise money. You're going to have to become a corporation so that Dominion doesn't ultimately sue you guys as individuals and try to scare you away. But raising money was important because we knew that we were going to have expert witnesses along the way, and those experts were not going to necessarily all be free, and so having different organizations is really, really important. The other comment I'll make about different organizations is that different organizations have a different approach. The Friends of Nelson and ABRA, really kind of came together as a community and fought for the community. And then there was another organization, which I can't remember right now, but it was an organization that raised a lot of money. And their approach was to use public relations and to use more of access to their own government officials at a high level, trying to go in and getting those people to slow this thing down and take a harder look and maybe talk to Dominion and maybe even, consider alternatives. One of the things that never happened, in my opinion, which I still do not understand, is that there were a couple of organizations that approached Dominion and approached leadership in Dominion and in the state of Virginia and said, we're willing to propose some alternative routes. And Dominion simply was not interested. They never responded. And as a result, they ended up losing the whole pipeline.
Sometimes I've heard the strategy described as 1,000 cuts, right? And I want to, and I think there's some truth to that. The strategy we put together is a little more nuanced. We specifically, you all remember that FERC would issue certificates. When this first came down, the lay of the land was first FERC would approve a project, but you couldn't get into court to challenge it. Right. For months, in some cases years, but the pipeline would get built. And so there were the few examples we could find of opponents beating FERC. The pipeline had already been built and was operational. So that was the issue we needed to take head on. And so the other permits gave us an opportunity to, we set about to stop construction to preserve the status quo in order to get FERC into court.
Because one of the things that we talked about early on, when the first couple of meetings that we ever got together with the Friends of Nelson, and we would talk about the fact that NEPA in and of itself is not going to win this case. It will require them to comply with the law and do a good environmental impact statement and talk about alternatives and do all those things. But the NEPA law does not provide really for a permanent injunction on a proposed action, i.e. the pipeline. The Endangered Species Act does, and if you don't get an NPDES permit, you can't build your project. So those other laws had more teeth, if you will, in terms of really stopping the pipeline from going forward.
The problem that you had with eminent domain, the law was very unfavorable to the landowner. So the law gave Dominion almost complete authority. Essentially, what eminent domain said is when FERC granted the certificate of public necessity such that they authorized the building of the pipeline, with that came the right of eminent domain. So FERC was actually out of it at that point. Now we're pulling them back into it, of course, but FERC was basically out of it. So it was Dominion. You go forth. You put the screws to people. You sue people in federal court. That sort of thing. And the law, therefore, was very favorable to Dominion. Fighting eminent domain was extremely, extremely hard.
because the FERC process has legal consequences, landowners need to be able to protect their rights. And the way that they can do that, the only way they can do that in the FERC process is to do what's called filing an intervention. An intervention makes you a formal party to the proceeding. So you have a stake in that case as much as the pipeline, which is also a party to the proceeding. So that's the first thing that's very important about intervening. And once you intervene, it entitles you to receive, all of the filings that are made in the case. And the second thing is that when you intervene, it allows you to raise challenges to the project later on. And you may feel like, there could even be circumstances where you're not sure if you're going to be impacted or how greatly you'll be impacted. But if you don't intervene, you kind of waive the ability to do that. So, if the project is approved and you want to challenge anything from a reroute, if it's going like straight through the middle of your field, you say you don't like it, so you don't want it at all, but at least you want to be able to say, look, in a worst case scenario, if you're going to build this darn thing, put it in the road. You don't need it to put it right through my cow pasture. It allows you to say that too. It allows you to also, in a worst case scenario, bring the case to court and bring a challenge in court to the action. But if you don't file that intervention, you're out of luck on all of it. So that's why it's just really important. And it's so easy to file what's called a dockless intervention, which is just like you can fill out a form at the FERC website. You can do it, more extensively, but just anything just to kind of stick your foot into the proceeding.
In hindsight, most people probably aren't going to be as late in the game as I was. I think this, most people have more time than they think, and should definitely use that time to interview in person multiple attorneys and talk to actual people who have been affected in the past on pipelines directly, and not. I would not recommend going off of web reviews or necessarily even just recommended lists by advocacy groups. I think it's much better to get a hold of, if you could find a trusted attorney that practices in another field, like a family attorney or someone like that, you could ask them, but even better, try to get a hold of an advocacy group that could connect you with landowners who had used various attorneys and get a sense. I would also advise people to really take their time and get a sense of they don't want to hire someone that is just seems like they're trying to sell them something, because it's not. The person you want to hire is not going to be someone that's trying to sell you something that you don't want to buy. You shouldn't feel like you're getting sold a used car. You shouldn't feel like someone's trying to get your vote, a slick politician. It should be someone. This guy really knows his stuff. He's told me he's made his pitch in a professional, articulate way. And to ask lots and lots of questions, and if those questions aren't answered clearly and concisely, and even better, try to get those answers in writing, because if someone will only answer your questions orally, and that for me, that's kind of a red flag. If an attorney's not willing to put it in writing, there might be a reason for that. So those are some of the lessons that I learned.
There was a tremendous variety. I would say that, and part of why I started tracking it was to see what might be some of the variables that implicated that. And the first thing that I would say is that people who signed early got crap. Very few that signed early got the kind of settlements that people later did.
I'd say it is absolutely important, if you're going to hire a lawyer, we have one that's knowledgeable about this process, environmental stuff and so forth, not the local lawyers, because it wasn't only Ralph Turpin that said go forward, it was somebody else as well, a lawyer. So I'd say, they couldn't really help. They didn't know enough about it, they didn't have enough personal interest in it, because speaking of Ralph, he wasn't going to be personally affected. It's going to be way out there, take your money and run. But, now that I know more about all of it, yeah, having somebody like you were speaking of, Cordelia, that's important to have somebody with some knowledge, real knowledge about how these things work.
Well, a letter in the mail says Dominion's coming through, and they want us to think there's nothing we can do. Hard to believe, but we found out it's true. They want to build a 42-inch pipeline. We don't want you pipeline.